Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of Coding Cardio. Today we're going to focus on Flexbox. We're going to start this from a very beginner-friendly angle to those that have never used it before, don't know what it is, and just kind of want to learn more about it, see how they can start incorporating it into their projects. I have an example here that we're going to walk through together. So if we take a look at this right here, I have this box laid out. And there's really nothing, there's no Flexbox properties on this yet. We're gonna do that together. So first off, I have this purple background container and then these three aquamarine boxes inside of it that we're gonna kind of style around and walk through how we can start using Flexbox in something like this and create sort of a 3-column flexible layout. So before we actually dive into that, I wanted to take a look at this graph right here because I think this can be useful before we actually dive into anything. And it's not super important that you memorize any of this, all of these rather. So the first thing I want to take a look at is this flex container. I think it's good to understand this at a high level. And our flex container is going to be the thing that holds all of our flexible items, our flexible boxes rather, as the name pertains to. So our flex container is going to be this parent thing, as we can see back here. And then the children of that flex container are going to be these flex items, which we can see here. So going back to this example, this purple thing will be our flex container and these aquamarine boxes will be our flexible items. And then the only other thing I want you to take away from this is thinking about Flexbox in terms of these axes here. So we have this main axis and this cross axis, and this is something we'll reference a few times. So our main axis is going to be the axis that goes in the direction of the way our items are laid out. So our items are laid out horizontally like this. Our main axis is going to be horizontal. Our cross one is going to be the perpendicular one, so it's going to be vertical in this case. And before you actually start writing any code, think of Flexbox as just a way to position different items along this axis and controlling the space that they take up along the axis. And we'll start to see that. So let's actually dive in right now. So like I said, there's no flex properties on this, so let's start doing that now. So our flex container, we're going to make it a flex container by giving it a display property of flex. And now our purple background becomes a flex container, and our items we see kind of shift a little bit. I'll undo that just so you can see. It kind of looks like they, instead of stacking, they become these these vertical bars instead. But what's actually happening is once this becomes a flex container, our flex items in here, which are these, again, the aquamarine boxes, are going to be these flex items as we see here. They're only going to take up as much space as the actual box themselves. So we think about the content, the padding we have here, and the margins, and that's really the only space they'll take up inside of the flex container along the main axis. So again, our flex items are laid out horizontally like this, so our main axis is now going to be the left to right here, and our items are only going to by default take up that much space. And then our cross axis, they're going to flow to the edge of the cross axis here. We can see they're taking up that much space here. But that's what it's going to do just from that level. And if we wanted to kind of switch up the axis here, we could say something like flex direction, and then we could make that a column. So now our axis is flipped, and our main axis is the up and down, and then the cross axis is left and right. And again, the main axis, the items are only going to take up as much space as the actual flex item to begin with. So let's actually switch that to row, so we can control how that's laid out. The next thing, we can see if we make this smaller, it doesn't really wrap, and we do want those to eventually wrap. One quick thing we can do here is do just a flex wrap. I think this one's a pretty easy one to remember, but if we make this small, we can see that eventually, oh no, flex wrap is wrap, not flex. So our flex wrap, we want it to wrap, so which means when we get to this space where a flex item has nowhere else to go, which means we account for the content, the padding, the border, and the margins. As soon as that item runs out of space, it's going to wrap to the new line here, as we can see. So right off the bat, we didn't have to write any media queries to get these to kind of respond this way. So that's working as we'd expect. Cool. So now let's get into if we wanted to move these items along the different axes. So one thing we can do here, and one thing I do want to write out, is that there's two different properties that we're going to use to do this. One's called justify content, And then the next one is called align items. So our justified content, space on main axis, and then space on cross axis. So our justified content is going to control items along the main axis here, and the align items is going to be the cross axis. And these are two that are very easy to confuse with each other. Sometimes I'll just like throw different properties until I get it laid out right, but I find it's most helpful when I think of it in terms of how it's being affected on the axis. So again, our justified content is on the main axis, so we can say, and we want to call these on the flex container, which is our purple box here. So we can say justified content and then center. So now we see our bars get moved along the main axis. They're centered right in the center of it. We could also say things like flex end. So we say, hey, position these on the very end of the flex container. And then out of the box, it gives us these different commands. If we want to kind of put space in between those items, we can put space around those items. And it gives us these values right out of the box that we can use with Flexbox, which is really nice. But just keep in mind, justify is always going to be the main axis, align items is going to be the cross one. Let's actually use the align item so we can see. So when we see center, we see that the height starts to shrink here. And what we're saying here, because before, remember, it's going to take up all the space on the cross axis. So we can say, align item, say, hey, we don't want that to take up the full space. We only want it to take up the center of the axis, which we can see is what's happening here. We can also say the same commands as we used before with flex end and flex start if we kind of wanted to control that. Or we can just do center and we should still get the wrapping, which we see that we do. So that works really great. So I did not mean to open that dictionary open. Okay, so let's take away that because we do want this to span the full width. Let's actually go back to how we had it before. So the next thing I want to talk about is we have all of this extra space here that's really unaccounted for. And we can see that in a real website, this might not be ideal. Maybe we want the items to take up the full length of that. So what we can do here is let's step into our flex item. So all of our sections here, and I can show you the HTML, these sections are just going to be flex items here. So once we target the flex item, we can say something like flex 1. And we can see that dynamically now our items are taking up the full length of the flex container, and it's still going to respond once it runs out of space. And so this flex property here, whatever this value is, I want to make very clear that this isn't a value like you might think of like a number being assigned, because we can make it some crazy number and we still get the same functionality. So a very important thing to remember is the value that you're giving the flex here is going to be used as a proportional value. It's going to say what amount of space should I give out among each flex items for the remaining space in the container. So again, this extra purple thing is the space in the container. This is saying give out an equal amount of space to each flex item. And if we wanted to kind of see that distinction, we could say something like, what did I name that box? We could say something like box 2 if we wanted to give more space to a different item. And let's actually number these so they're a little bit easier to see here. So we could say box 2 and we say flex 2. And this is going to say give box 2 twice as much of the remaining space as any of the other items. Because remember, this is going to overwrite this for box 2 only. And then we could easily say give it 3 times as much space, 4 times as much space. So this is just a proportional value. We could just as easily start it with 10. I think 1's a good base to start with because it's kind of easy to extrapolate from there. So then with flex, another, and I don't want to overwhelm you with too many properties, but one other thing you can do with flex is give it a second value, which is a pixel width. And this is basically going to say, and I want to show an example here. So if we say 200, not only do we see 1 and 3 are taking up more space now, even though we're telling it to take up double on box 2, but we should see these wrapping a bit sooner, and we do. You notice that 1 and 3 don't collapse as closely anymore before they start wrapping. And when you give a pixel value here, this is essentially saying each flex item will be given X amount of space first before being shared out by the proportional value. So in simpler terms, 1 and 3 are getting 200 pixels each of the remaining space before any of before the proportional values are taken into consideration, which we see is why this box 2 looks so much smaller now, is because 1 and 3 have 200 pixels of extra space before they're given anything. So this is a cool thing. You can kind of play around with this and play around with some values. Maybe you want to have like an emphasized box 2 that you sort of want to, play around with some different values and see when you can get things wrapping. And all of a sudden we have this really nice looking 3-column layout that's, fully responsive. We can kind of control when it responds. Because remember, that space is going to be given to those boxes now. So they're wrapping sooner because of that, because they're accounting for that extra space we're giving with the flex property. So cool. So now that we have a basic understanding of that, and again, I'll refer back to this, all we have really done is just establish these main and cross axis and then move the items along the axis and determine how much space they're going to take up on that axis. And that's really, it's as simple as that. Just establishing those axes and then determining how you want to move the items around there. So then knowing that, let's apply that to this text here, because we do have this nice looking layout, but our text is still floating up top here to the left, and that's not really what we want. Say we wanted to sort of center that and make it look nice so that no matter what size of the viewport we were on, we'd always guarantee that we had center text. So take a minute and think about how you would do that, and I'll make the CSS a little bit bigger. So yeah, take a minute. So the first thing you might think to do is just put, similar to how we had the align and justify properties on there, you might think to do, well, let me just align item center or justify content center. But we don't actually see it affecting any of our text. And that is because these items can only be applied to flex containers. So going back here, we can only apply to these flex containers. And right now these sections are just flex items. There are no flex containers. So we can actually make that both right here. It is a flex item, but it allows us to also make it a flex container as well. So now we see this jump to the center because then these paragraph tags become flex items within this section container. And now we can see that we get this nice little layout that, no matter what size we're on, our text is always going to be centered. And yeah, it's really as easy as that. And there are a lot, more flex properties that you can start to dig into, but I just kind of wanted to give you an overview of how you can at least get started with this, playing around with some different values and seeing how you can center things. Yeah, so hopefully this was helpful. At least a nice intro to get started with using Flexbox on your own. Yeah, if you have any questions, feel free to leave a comment. I will answer as many as I can in the comments or reach out to me on Twitter. I will also leave a link to the Mozilla Developer Network explaining Flexbox, so you can start to get into some of the more complex properties and complex uses of Flexbox. But yeah, I hope this was helpful. I hope you learned something today, and I will see you in the next one. Bye.